Hello, global gardeners. It's great to see everybody checking in. It's great to have you here on a Monday as we get ready for 90 wonderful minutes of gardening information. I'll be answering a lot of your questions. I know you'll be sharing information back and forth. And today's focus will be on food crops in particular. But of course, we'll be answering a whole bunch of stuff all across the gardening spectrum. So it's good to see you here today. It's good to have everyone checking in from all over the world. Bonjour, Isabelle from Quebec, Canada, and a lot of the regulars checking in all over the United States. We have a question right off the bat. Wonderful way to start the day with a super chat from Craig Humphreys saying, I collected some anemone flower seeds in a zipper bag and then forgot them for a couple of days. Many of us do that. Now they have a furry fungus on them. Can they be saved? And yes, the likelihood is that they can be saved. Now that you've discovered it, go ahead and open up the bag, spread them out on the table, a sheet of paper, and let them dry out again. Chances are it's a mold that's growing on whatever surface moisture might be on the seed. And so that furry fungus initially does not burrow too deep. And so it probably hasn't affected the seed yet. It's when you get that black fungus and mold that starts growing that really gets into the seed that can be a problem. But that light stuff on the outside is probably just living on the moisture inside the bag where it was resting against the seed. So should be able to be saved. That's a pretty good, strong seed, and I don't think it's going to be affected. Best thing you can do is just let it dry out to get rid of that and then put it in the ground as soon as you're ready to plant, and we'll see what happens. Let us know, but my guess is that the seeds will be perfectly fine. And I saw that you might be missing the live show and might see this on replay, but again, thanks for that super chat and thanks for that question. Great way to start the day. Let's see what else we have. There's a couple other questions that popped up that I want to go ahead and start off with here, since we're going to be focusing on food, get some of this other stuff out of the way quickly. One of the questions came from Laura, wondering, do soil and pH and fertility and moisture probe testers really have any reliability? And yes, to a certain degree. And so I've bought those pH testers and those moisture testers and fertility testers. I've had many over the years. And initially, they do work pretty well. And they'll give you relatively accurate information. So for instance, a pH tester, if your soil is a 6.0, the tester will probably give you a reading of 5.9 to 6.1. It's relatively close. But the problem that I have is that they don't stay reliable over a period of time. Most of them work with batteries, and so there'll be some conductivity of electricity in the probe, and that's how they get their reading. But what happens, and this is what I've experienced, is that over time the probe begins to deteriorate as you're putting it into wet soil, especially if you have acidic soil. The readings are going to be off. You're going to have a pH or a moisture level or whatever kind of probe you have that will start giving you erroneous readings. And I saw this first in a moisture meter, and it was a double probe that you stick into the ground, and it tells you how moist the soil is. And it was just a little needle on a gauge that went from wet to dry. And it was pretty accurate for the first couple weeks. Well, I left it in one of our beds in the greenhouse at the Galileo School. And I noticed that even when the soil was moist, at the probes, it started showing that the soil was dry. And that was just because I think the probes were beginning to be affected by the pH and any other ingredients that might be in the soil. And so it was throwing off the reading of those probes. And so I have had better luck with just sticking the probe in, testing whichever it is you want the test for, cleaning off the probe, and then sticking it in a cool, dry location, and then putting it back in the soil. It's when you leave them in the soil over a period of time that I've noticed they begin to deteriorate. So I hope that helps out with you. And there's Chris. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here today. And I appreciate that contribution for being the goat every day. I'll be talking a little bit about the goat and your own approach to gardening as I approach gardening, of course, a little bit later when we get to the end of the show and talk about the philosophy, because the goats aren't always the goats in every area. So there's a teaser for what's coming up in the towards the end of the show. So I do appreciate that. That is one of those things that it's a nice way to start the day, to see all of your appreciation and all the rest that comes with it. Kevin is asking a question about sweet potatoes. He says you can't hill sweet potatoes like you do other potatoes, but you can and should build up the soil around the plant. And so, and this was in response to something that I guess Georgia Sunshine was saying. And so Kevin's right, but I will point out something about sweet potatoes. And so sweet potatoes don't grow like the russet potatoes or other type of potatoes that we grow, where you might be mounding the soil on top of the plant. But sweet potatoes really like warm soil. And so when you start your sweet potatoes, if you grow them in a mound, basically just a raised area of soil, that little raised mound of soil will warm up and should stay warmer than just the flat level ground. So when you look at a seed packet, or if you buy your slips for putting the sweet potatoes in, you may see the directions that say to plant them in a mound. And so it is a single thing. You just do the mound and then start your sweet potatoes. But you're exactly right. You don't hill up the sweet potatoes after they start growing like a lot of other plants that we might see. And Severin started off the day before the show started asking a really good question. And it's one that I've addressed periodically over the many months that we've had this live stream. But the question is there a food crop that I've given up on, that I tried to grow without success due to disease or pests or bad luck or whatever happens to be? And yes, of course. I think all gardeners at some point will try something, keep trying it, realize they just don't have success with it, and then give up. That's all part of our gardening journey. So the question is, what have you tried and given up on? Go ahead and comment in the remarks so we can actually see some comparisons of what other people have tried and not had success with, as I tell you some of mine. One of the very first that I had great aspirations for were cherry trees. And I did everything you're supposed to do for cherry trees. I grew 2 different varieties so that I would have good pollination. I did some research in my area and found out that sweet cherries don't do that well, but sour cherries do okay. And so this was over a period of about 3 or 4 years that I was trying to grow cherry trees, and I never got a single cherry. The trees themselves just don't grow well in my area. And I don't know any gardeners personally in my area that are growing cherry trees, but I thought I would give it a try. And so once I realized no one else was doing it, and I tried doing it and didn't have any success, I'm not going to try it again. It just takes too long. So that's one of those long time food crops that I won't try again. But every year I would love to grow beefsteak tomatoes, those big juicy tomatoes, and I just can't. My season just isn't long enough. And they will grow and they'll start to get to that nice big size, but they never ripen. And I've talked about this many times, where you have to look at the length of your growing season when choosing the plants that you grow in your vegetable garden. It's critical, because if you choose to grow a plant that takes longer than your season provides, then you'll never get a harvest. It's just that simple. And so for me, beefsteak tomatoes fall into that category. where I've tried them, and just even with protection, even with the hoops and plastic at the end of the season, they just never reach the point that I can harvest. And then another one that might surprise you is sweet peppers. I can grow hot peppers very well. In fact, this last week I put in I think about 20 or 22 hot pepper plants in my new beds, but I'm not growing any sweet peppers this year outside. Now in the greenhouse, I've had great success with the sweet peppers, but my environment, with the wind, with the high heat, with the hail, the sweet peppers just never seem to grow to the point where I can harvest them. I want a nice big bell pepper, and when I've grown sweet peppers, I get little bell peppers. And so that's another one of those that just environmentally, I just haven't had much success with. So there's a couple that I've tried, and when I get my greenhouse, I'll try growing the sweet peppers in the greenhouse and see if I have success with that. But outdoors, it just doesn't work anywhere near like it should. Hey, Tony, Simplified Gardening's channel. Tony O'Neill is with us today. Great to see you here. And Tony is always a great person to have on the chat, filled with information. And I've said this many, many times. Even when Tony's not here, I tell you about Tony's Simplified Gardening channel. So check that out. Great to have you here, Tony. I'm glad to see that you're well enough to join us. And I'm looking forward to many more of your videos, of course. Mage Grey Wolf says, I so far haven't had luck with potatoes, but I haven't given up yet. And I was just out. I did all my watering this morning. It's incredibly hot here in Colorado. And I've seen some comments as well coming from Thalia and Frank already. We're supposed to get close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 38 degrees Celsius. And it's just extremely hot. The next 3-day forecast for me is a few degrees less than that, but we're going to set new heat records for each of the next 3 days. So extremely hot. So I was outside this morning watering my garden and watering my potatoes. I'm growing my potatoes in the cloth grow bags, and they are doing great. So anticipate seeing them in future videos, because I've had difficulty growing potatoes in the past. But after watching all of Tony O'Neill's potato videos on Simplified Gardening and doing more research and trial and error, my potatoes are doing incredibly well this year. So I was extremely happy for that. And I hope that you will try potatoes again after watching some of Tony's videos and my videos, and maybe you'll have better success moving into the future. That's one of those things that if you can grow a potato, you can feed your family. A potato, by many gardeners and actually many experts, is considered to be just about the perfect food crop. The nutrients in a potato will feed your family. It's as simple as that. You saw this in Ireland is the key example in history, where you had an entire population that was being fed by potatoes. Now, disastrously, of course, they had a famine as a result of the disease that came in and killed the potatoes that they were growing. But it just goes to show that if you're to grow any particular food crop with the intent of eating it and feeding your family, potatoes are the way to go. And so see what you can do to grow potatoes and learn to grow potatoes better. They grow pretty easily once you get them all set up. They harvest, especially if you're growing them in containers like Tony does and like I do. They're extremely easy to harvest. And then they store for months, and they're packed with nutrients. So there's the first of the food crops that I'm going to recommend over the course of this live stream today is potatoes. They grow in most regions of the world, which is why they are essentially the perfect plant to grow in your garden for food purposes. So yeah, Mage Grey Wolf says, hadn't given up yet. Or I guess that's still the same comment before. And so that's exactly the point is, don't give up yet. Keep on trying. So Yeah, Kevin says, just finished with potatoes from a 20-gallon grow bag. Thanks to Tony. So always nice to see him in there. Jean-Pierre, bonjour. I saw spinach, but because of the late freeze and then early heat, I see my spinach crawling over the ground. So I planted new spinach that can stand the heat and harvest in October. And so that's another one of those things that I want to talk about. So merci, Jean-Pierre. It's one of these things that I just saw today. The broccoli that I'm growing has already started to bolt because I've had temperatures already touching on 90 degrees, about 35 Celsius, and it's just getting, or 32 Celsius. No, 35. 35 is 95 Fahrenheit. The bolting has already started, and my spinach has already started to bolt. My lettuce hasn't started to bolt yet, but I'm going to be harvesting most of it here. I'm just waiting to film because it looks so beautiful right now. So as soon as I film the video that's coming out in a few days where I'll be talking about plants and pests, then I'm going to harvest what I have because my plants are bolting as well. One of the things you can do is look for seeds that are labeled as slow bolting. And so I just put some cilantro seeds in the ground, and it's a slow bolting variety of cilantro. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to bolt, but like Jean-Pierre in Belgium, if you see that you're starting to have plants bolt, you don't necessarily need to give up on those plants. Instead, look for some of these slow bolting varieties, wait a little bit, and plant or sow the seeds in summer. Now, as they start growing and reach the point in autumn where it's going to be closer to harvest, by then the temperatures are going to start falling. And these slow bolt varieties, which in the heat aren't going to bolt as quickly, when they're exposed to the cooling temperatures, you can expect that they won't bolt at all. And so that's one of the approaches I take around this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, where the early plants that we put in are starting to send up their flower stalks, they're bolting. Take them out, then you put in the summer crops, the squashes and the melons and the peppers and the tomatoes and all those kind of plants. But then another month, maybe two, I'll start my seeds again and get my fall garden started and try to choose those slow bolting plants. So, hey, Chris, what size should I plant my trees in the earth? I started from seed. They're about 6 inches tall now, and they're apple trees. The heat, I would actually not do it in the heat. I would go ahead and wait till fall. I think, and many researchers agree with theirs. There's a lot of university research that shows that trees actually do better when planted in the fall, and especially for a young tree, you don't want to put it in the summer. It's just going to get baked. Try to keep it in a sheltered area before you put it in the ground. 6 inches now, if you leave it in the pot and try not to expose it to harsh conditions, it'll probably be 9 or 10 inches tall by the time that autumn comes. And then you can go ahead and put it in the ground. Or overwinter it in a nice sheltered area and put it in the ground next spring. So I would say either this fall or next spring would probably be the best time to go ahead and start doing that. Hey, Tony, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that you doing that. That's high praise indeed. I think Tony has some of the best videos on YouTube. And when somebody like Tony O'Neill says he likes my channel, you've just made my whole week and my whole month. So thank you so much for that, Tony. I really do appreciate it, mate. You're a good friend. I thank you for that. And Tony does live streams as well. Occasionally, Tony will do a live stream, typically on Fridays, and they're usually at about this time of day that I'm doing the Monday live stream. He'll do them occasionally on live stream. So I hope you get back live here soon, Tony, and you can go to Tony's channel and see when those are coming up. I always seem to miss them because Friday is one of my busiest days of the week where I'm going into town and getting things done. So I haven't been able to actually attend, but I always watch Tony's live chats on replay, because there's good information there as well. Always a good thing. Okay, Celeste is saying planted an Evans Bali cherry. Hope it does well in zone 3-4. I don't know that specific variety, but I'm assuming you did a little bit of research ahead of time and found out that it would survive in your zone. That's one of the most important things when you're growing the perennial food crops, is make sure they match up with your hardiness zone. And so I thought a few of my plants didn't make it through the winter, and I'm in a zone 5, and I saw today that one of my gooseberries, I went ahead and bought a replacement gooseberry from Stark Brothers, and just got notification yesterday that it's delayed even more until July. So now I'm not going to be able to put that plant in the ground until probably August, because I want to harden it off just to make sure it can handle my weather. But I noticed the spot that had a gooseberry that I didn't think made it through the winter and that I was going to dig up and put this new plant in, it's sprouting. There's actually some new shoots coming from the ground. All of the other gooseberries around it are big and lush already, but I just started getting sprouts. And so when you put in those kind of trees and bushes and shrubs that are going to be food producing, have some patience with them, especially if you live in a zone that's got harsh winters. It may take a while for them to get established, especially in the first year. I just put the plant in last year. This was the first winter, and obviously it needed extra time to send up the shoots. The other one has already been growing for at least a month, if not 6 weeks, and this one is brand new. So do have patience when you're growing a lot of these plants, because it's one of those things that most of the time they're going to survive if the nursery tells you it's hardy to your zone. It just may take a while for it to get established to the point that it's coming up in spring every year and then putting out a lot of new growth before summer comes. Okay, let's see what we have. Yeah, Tony says hard to kill off gooseberries, which is why I was really surprised by it. But like I said, it was my first year, and so now I'm going to put the new gooseberry in a completely different area over by my fruit trees where I'm putting in a food forest. So it's going to find a place in the garden, which is great. Kevin says, I have 3 types of cucumbers, lots of flowers and bees, but no fruits. Only seen 1 or 2 female flowers. And so the thing about cucumbers and squash and melons and most of these summer crops that we're growing, they're going to send out their male flowers first. And this may happen over a period of weeks. And so for cucumbers, it's not unusual for the first week or 2 to have nothing but male flowers on those plants. And then as they grow and get established and start sending out new branches, you'll expect to see more and more of the female flowers. And the whole reason for this is because the female flower needs to be pollinated right away in the first day, within hours of opening. And if there aren't any male flowers, well, then that female flower is just going to drop off the plant. And so it's great that you have 3 varieties because there's greater likelihood of pollination, and it's not unusual to have a lot of male flowers and then just start to see 1 or 2 female flowers. And some of this happens without you even realizing it. I really try to pay attention to the blooming and the pollination, and I'll go out and suddenly there's 3 or 4 cucumbers on my plants that I had not seen before. So don't be surprised if you do have some female flowers that might be appearing and then being pollinated, and before you know it, you have fruit. There might be some female flowers that are hidden in there that you just haven't seen, but you should expect to see more of them. And I have a video where I show how to hand pollinate pumpkins, and I talk more about the flowers and how you can tell the difference between a male flower and a female flower. So I suggest you check out that video. Just because it is important information as you're inspecting your garden to recognize what kind of flowers you have. And it's relatively simple. If you look at that little stem that goes from the main part of the branch to the flower, if it's straight, if it's one long, thin part of the plant, then it's typically a male flower. But if that little stem actually has a bulb or expands right before it gets to the flower, that's where the ovaries are. That's actually the female flower. And so when you compare a male flower and a female flower side by side, you'll see how they are completely different. And then when you look inside, you can actually see how the structure of the flower is different with the pollination and how it collects. So it's hard to describe it verbally, but I suggest you check that out, either my video or someone else's, so you can learn how to differentiate. Okay, let's see what Michael Harrington has to say. Thank you so much for that super chat, Michael. Your channel's so helpful. Thank you. That's why I do this. I so much appreciate all of you expressing the gratitude and the super chats and just in your comments, because that's the reason I do this, is to make an average person a better gardener and to make good gardeners great gardeners with the information that I give. And so I so appreciate that when you share that with me. And I've just had so many people over the years that have shared with me all of their accomplishments by watching some of my videos, listening to information like we just pointed out a little while ago, with Tony's channel as well. Gardeners who are having great success with potatoes from watching Tony's channel. It's so nice when you can find someone that can speak to you, give you the information you want, and then you use that information to your benefit. That's why I do this. And so it's greatly appreciated when you let me know that it's working. And Gretchen, thank you so much. A new member to the channel. We do have the Gardener Scott community that you can join, and you can do that from the home page, or if you're watching on a mobile device, or actually like a laptop, you'll see a join button below the videos, and that's way to join the community. So lots of good perks with that. And it's one of the things we've got coming up for members of the channel. So there's 3 different channel membership levels, and you get different perks at different levels. It's a great way to support what I'm doing on this channel, but it's also a great way for you all, the community, to get together, because we share so much great information. We share photos, experience, tell stories. It's just really a wonderful community. But at the gardening training and gardening collaborator levels, I do extra live streams, and there's other perks associated with that as well. And so if you happen to be a channel member and you didn't see the post that I put out yesterday and today, we have a live stream coming up on this Saturday, a members only live stream. So if you're not a member, do consider joining. No obligation. I'll still be doing all these live streams for free, and I'll still be doing all of my videos every week for free, but that's just an extra opportunity for gardeners to get together, and I provide the forum so that we can do that. So I'm so glad that you joined as a new member. That's wonderful. Okay, and Tony's saying that's one thing that he needs to do as well. It's one of those things that I mentioned this a few live streams ago. Most of the top gardening channels now have memberships, and some of them offer just a little bit. I do think that my channel offers more to members than any of the other gardening channels, but it is a way that YouTube has set up to help support the channel, and it is a way for we as creators to give more back to you. And so I do hope to see you set up a membership, Tony, and see what kind of things that you have to offer. It's because Tony's got a great community. A lot of you also are part of Tony's community, but there's a lot of other members that don't know me from his channel, and people that now, some of you that necessarily didn't know him, but now you do. Isabel, it's going to rain 3 straight days. Should I cover my young tomatoes so they don't rot? The tomatoes typically shouldn't rot on the vine due to rain. Uh, if you have a clay soil or a soil that holds a lot of water, then I would be concerned about drainage, possibly covering the plants just so they don't get waterlogged and drown. So chances are they're not going to rot. There is a possibility that they could drown, that there's so much water in the soil that it pushes out all the oxygen and the roots literally can't breathe, and that can kill the plant. So depending on how much rain you're talking about, you might want to cover if you've had problems with drainage in the past. But if you haven't had problems with drainage, and if it's just going to be a light, steady rain, and you're not expecting that the soil is going to be so saturated that it will drown your plants, then I would say no, you don't need to cover. It's one of those things that plants like rain, and Tony is growing in Wales in the UK, and he's had weeks and weeks of rain throughout different periods of the year. You can see that in his videos, and you can still grow in many regions of the world to just get rain every single day. So for 3 days of rain, I wouldn't be that concerned. In fact, I'd love to have 3 days of rain and leave my plants uncovered so that I don't have to get out and water them. But get back to your soil. Look at your soil and understand what kind of drainage issues you may or may not have, and that can help determine whether you cover your plants or not when you do have those rain situations. So Glenn is asking, where do you send garden photos to get a chance to have the photo used as the background? And so you can send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. And it is easy to do. That's where I'll see the photos. If you are a channel member, you can also post your pictures in a direct message to me on our Facebook group page. And so some of the photos that I've had in recent weeks actually came through the Gardener Scott community on the Facebook page. This one, let's go ahead and talk about this one today, because this one actually came to me through the Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com. And this one is from Zanoni. And I just love this background of the garden. This is just such a beautiful space with the brick patterns and the stone wall and trees and shrubs and flowers. And it's absolutely beautiful. But the primary reason that they sent me this photo is because of this bed that they're building here in the foreground. And so I think this photo is wonderful on many levels. First off, because it just shows such a beautiful garden area. But they have some mobility issues. And so because of those mobility issues, they're now building this raised bed. You can see it's quite sturdy. And that is one of the primary reasons that I have my raised beds. And I've said this before. I say it in my video where I talk about the reasons for doing raised beds. For mobility issues. If you physically have problems getting down on your knees, working in the soil, raised beds can be a great alternative to allow you to continue to grow all of the plants that you want to grow at a level that is more comfortable for you. And so for me, with some of my back issues, I am more comfortable working in raised beds. They cost more, they're more work, you have to fill them, but when it actually comes to grow the plants, you can do it easier if you have some of those mobility issues. And so that's what this demonstrates is this bed that they've constructed within their beautiful garden space so that they can grow some of the things they want because of family members that have mobility issues. And so think about that. If you are reaching a point in your life, or if there's someone in your family that you would like to share gardening with, but they're just not able to do some of what you can do, consider building a raised bed that's nice and sturdy and gives those options. So I think this is a beautiful opportunity. I don't know exactly what their plan is. I think they're filling the base with newspaper and cardboard, and like I talked about in my recent video where I use logs and branches to fill the base of my raised bed. You don't need to have soil all the way down to the bottom. You only need to have soil in the top portion where you're growing the plants. And you only need as much soil based on the plants that you choose to grow. I think 15 to 18 inches is ideal, and that's what I try to put in my beds. But in the first year, while that organic matter is decomposing at the bottom that I use, I'll go as little as 8 inches of amended soil when I'm growing some of my salad crops that have shallow roots. And so you have to match the soil to your plant. But consider a raised bed. And so thanks to Zanoni for sending me this photo and allowing me to use it as a backdrop. And if you do send a photo, do specifically give me permission to use your photo. I don't want to show something that you don't want to share. I don't want any copyright concerns. I want to show what you are sharing with me, and do try to be specific that you want me to then share it to everybody else that's going to be watching the live stream. And there are thousands of people that watch this either live or in replay. So I've got a lot more videos or a lot more photos in the queue that are coming in weeks ahead, and I'd love to have yours. So by all means, do feel to share those. And so Celeste is asking, are there particular tools that help us folks with mobility issues, types of hose? That's a good question. And so I have a few different types of tools for my raised beds. I have a hand hoe, and the handle is about 18 inches long, and I use that in some of my raised beds. I have weeders, same type of thing with a long handle, so that you can access all the bed to get some of the weeds out. The same thing with trowels. Long handled trowels I find work a little bit better. And so yes, there are definitely some tools. I don't have a good source to recommend to you to get those, but depending on the issues that you might have when you're gardening in a raised bed, do try to match the tool, because if you're using a full-size spade to turn the soil, well, then it kind of defeats the whole purpose. Instead, get a short-handled spade. And so I've got a spade that's got about a 3-foot handle or 2.5-foot handle that I can just use my arms to turn the soil. And in the open areas, I've got a full-size shovel, but I'll vary the tools based on the bed. And you can definitely find the tools to match what you're looking for. Tammy says, for people with mobility issues, a PVC pipe can help with seeding. That's a good idea. Poke the pipe into the dirt and send the seed down the tube. I've seen that. I haven't actually done that myself. In one of my videos where I talk about sowing seeds, I use a PVC pipe to make the hole. And so I'll stick in the PVC, pull it out, and it pulls out a plug of soil. And then I drop the seed in that hole and then put the plug of soil back on top of it. So I have done that, but that's a good idea to actually put the PVC pipe in and then drop the seed through the pipe if you've got issues with sowing the seed. So great suggestion. I appreciate that. Monica says, if I can recommend Bare Bones. They do a lot of long-handled stuff. They're expensive, but from what I hear tell, they're very good. Thank you for that recommendation. I'm not aware of them, but if it's something that people can find, it's a wonderful thing to share. And Mage Grey Wolf says a stirrup hoe works pretty well to level off the top of a raised bed. I use a stirrup hoe. I've shown, I had a video a year and a half ago on best gifts for gardeners, and the stirrup hoe was in it, because I think a stirrup hoe is a great tool to use. My stirrup hoe is full size handle, but I have seen some smaller ones with smaller handles that you might use in a raised bed. Okay, looks like Tony's leaving. See you, mate. Nice to have you here today. Always nice to talk with Tony and have him share what he has to give to all of us. Jeff is saying, we used a bulb collar to plant tomatoes and other vegetables that we have started from seed at the house or picked up at the store. And so the bulb planters, it's the same idea as I was just talking about, basically, where you put something in the ground and it pulls up a plug of soil. Then you can put, in this case, a bulb in. And that's a great idea. You can actually use like a bulb planter that's intended for planting bulbs in the fall. You don't have to just use it at one time of year. You can use it for seeds and other things that you might want to plant at other times of the year. So don't be afraid to use your tools in different ways. So, okay, let's pop back to the theme of the day. Thalia had asked early on about zucchini plants. And so if you are starting plants from seed, and zucchini is one of those type of things, or I think is it a courgette? Is the UK, is that the zucchini, or is it aubergine? I always get those two mixed up. But if you end up planting too many close together, which is very common when you're growing some of those big bushy squashes, the question is, will I kill my zucchini if I replant it to a different location? And the answer is pretty much yes, you probably will. Squash plants do not like to be transplanted. Now you can grow them in pots early indoors. I suggest using like a cow pot or a peat pot or a core pot, and then planting those directly in the ground because they don't like to have their roots disturbed very much during transplanting. But if you started one of those plants from seed and then try to dig it up and put it someplace else, you're probably going to kill the plant. And especially, I saw you comment that you're having 100-degree temperatures at that 35 Celsius range. And so there's going to be so much stress on those zucchini plants, I wouldn't even attempt it. You can thin out some of the plants that you have and start seeds in the new area, especially with the high heat. Those squash plants will germinate very quickly, probably just within a couple days, and begin growing pretty quickly as well. So even here in Colorado on the Front Range, it's not too late to start your zucchini. In fact, I just put some zucchini seeds in the ground a couple days ago, and I know I'm going to have a good long harvest because they grow so quickly and so well. So rather than trying to transplant your squashes and your melons and your pumpkins, I think in most cases it's better to just reseed, because unless you can dig up a very large area of soil and avoid disrupting their roots, they're going to suffer. And during the heat that many of us are having right now, they're going to suffer even more, and they'll probably never recover. So not sure if that's what you wanted to hear, but just start some new seeds and you'll probably have some good success with that. Yep, and John Ann is agreeing with me. Plop the new squash seed in the ground. They grow fast, exactly. Mark is saying most are 8 to 10 inches tall that were planted. It is. It's one of those things, especially if you're new to gardening, just start throwing seeds in the ground at different times of the year. And it's a great way to learn what grows quickly and what grows well. I talked before about succession planting, where you do that on purpose, where you start some seeds and then 2 or 3 weeks later, you put more of that same seed in, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, you put more of that seed in, so that you have a rolling cycle of harvests. But it's also a great idea just to experiment. If you're not familiar with how quickly a zucchini will grow when you plant it in June, give it a shot. That's the best way to find out. And then make notes in your garden journal. One of the reasons I do it, and I'll be talking about it in this video that's coming up, is for pest control. Many of us, especially those of us that have really long summers, it warms up in spring. We want to get plants in the ground. We start those seeds, and then the insect pests emerge and start eating our plants. And it's not unusual to lose an entire crop, depending on what the pest is and depending on what the plant is. When you learn about the plants you're growing and you learn about the pests in your area that are primarily attracted to that plant, you can break up the life cycle. And so in my area, I do have some borers, and I do have some other pests, to include caterpillars, that are appearing in late May and early June. So if I start my plants in late May or early June, It's food for all of those pests that are emerging from the soil or that are emerging as larvae from the eggs that were laid the year before. Well, if you wait until after those insect pests have emerged and then plant, when they emerge, there's no food. And so they're going to die off or go someplace else. So when you do start your seeds and those young plants emerge, now the pests are gone. And so that's one of the things I do. Even though I've got such a short season, I got tired of sowing early and then losing plants to the pests. And so I just modified my planting time for not everything, but for some of those plants that are most susceptible to the pests. I just delay sowing those seeds by 2 or 3 weeks. And especially for the fast growing squashes, I can't remember the last time I lost a plant to a pest that ate it. So that's one of those things when you're growing for food, you want your plant to grow, you want it to produce, and you want it to harvest. And by delaying just that little bit, you may ensure a harvest that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise if you have those kind of pests that are coming to your garden and will devastate your plants. So just something to think about. We've got Scott Head that's checking in. Great to have you here, Scott. You just missed Tony O'Neill. Scott is also another great gardener with a great channel, and he also has a live stream that he does periodically. And so I'll give a shout out to those of you that aren't familiar with Scott Head and his channel. I think it's wonderful. He's really ramped up the production. I'm doing 2 videos a week, and Scott is doing at least 3. I think have you done like 4 or 5 videos in some of the recent weeks, Scott? I'm having a hard time keeping up with your videos. But this is one of those things, I've talked about this before too. When you find channels that you like and you try to match up your area with a gardener who has expertise. Scott Head is down in the Houston area, and he's already had complete crops from seed to harvest because the weather is so great down there. And so if you're like me in an area that's much colder and I'm just getting started, Scott's already got a whole harvest and starting over again too, but with a completely different set of plants because of the environmental differences. And so check out Scott's channel and you'll see some of the things that he's been doing. That's one reason I'm guessing why he's been doing so many videos, is because he's right at the peak of his gardening season, while some of us are just getting started. I didn't have a spring this year. I think I said this last week. We went from temperatures with a high of 50 degrees, 10 degrees Celsius, and then 1 week later, we had highs that were 80 and 90 degrees, around the 30 degrees Celsius range. And I was watering my purple bed. I've talked about the purple bed. And so I've got purple potatoes and purple kohlrabi and purple beans and purple okra growing in this purple bed. And my plan was for my granddaughters to help me with that bed, sow the seeds, and I had them over, and it was just too cold. This was just a couple weeks ago. This was the end of May that I was going to be starting all these seeds, and it was just too cold for us to be outside putting seeds in the ground. So they weren't able to help me. I was able to put the seeds in a few days later when it warmed up. And now 2 weeks later, they've all germinated and they're growing and they look great, and it's summer. So it's just crazy. But check out Scott Head's channel because you can see some of that. And like me, one of the things that I like about Scott's channel is he shows when things go wrong. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. Sometimes things happen, and Scott's got some great videos where he points out what went wrong in the garden as a way to help you out so that you can hopefully get things right based on those of us that have those kind of mistakes. Jean-Pierre is asking, have a young peach tree covered with aphids. Is neem oil also a help? And if not, you'd have a kitchen problem that also helps. And so neem oil can be good. One of the issues with neem oil, whenever you use it, is It's slow to kill the insect. It is pretty effective on aphids, but you do need to cover both the top and the bottom of leaves. And so on a tree, I'm not as big a fan of using neem oil unless it's a small tree, real small, because you might not be able to cover all the leaves. If the tree is small enough that you can get to all those leaves, then yes, neem oil can be effective. But a water spray, especially on a tree, is extremely effective. Just take your watering wand, and if it's got a hard, fast spray attachment that you can put onto it, use that. Spray the aphids off, and that's one of the most effective ways to deal with aphids on trees and whiteflies and anything else that pops off, is spray them off. Because once they fall down to the ground, they're going to die. They'll probably not survive the fall, but if they do survive the fall, they're going to be damaged to the point that they can't crawl back up or fly back up to the leaves. So a good, strong spray of water is what I recommend before resorting to some concoction like soap and water and other things that you might see. So, oh yeah, thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it. Planted new zucchini as you were talking, and will reduce number of plants in other area per your suggestion. Well, I'm glad I could help. Zucchini is such an educational plant because I don't know of many gardeners who didn't learn the hard way of putting too many seeds too close together. Now you have this big plant and you didn't realize it was going to get that big, or you had too many plants, which meant you had zucchini coming out your ears. It's a great plant to grow, so sturdy, so fast growing, and so educational. Okay, let's see what else we have. Let's see. I see a lot of the answers to a lot of things popping back and forth. I think that's great that you all are helping each other out. Let me know if there's any other questions that you have coming this way. Pamela's asking, just missed it. Let me go back to Pamela's question. Now that spinach and arugula are done, what can I plant in its place in zone 7B? You've got so many wonderful options. Like we are just talking about, zucchini and squash are great choices. Cucumbers is one of my go-to crops for the areas where I pull out the spinach and the arugula and the lettuce and the spring crops. Cucumbers are among my favorite to put in, and especially in zone 7, you should probably have a long enough season that you can even do some succession planting with part of the bed being some cucumbers now, and then wait a few weeks and do some more cucumbers. I love cucumbers. One of the issues with growing cucumbers as a food crop is that they do get old. They'll reach a point where they just start to fade, and they don't put on as much growth, they don't put on as many flowers, and at that point most of us have reached the end of our season, and so we just let it happen. And it's discouraging when the cucumbers slow down and we aren't getting that regular harvest. Well, one of the ways to avoid that is succession planting with cucumbers. Is you put some in, and then a couple weeks later put some more in, a couple weeks later put some more in, and then as those first cucumbers are beginning to fade, you've got a whole nother set or two that are reaching their prime. So consider cucumbers. Depending on the melon and when your first frost is due in the fall, you might be able to do some quick growing melons. Now, I grow quick growing melons, the small ones, not like the big watermelons. And so the ones I choose are typically like 80 or 90 day varieties. You can probably get away with some plants like that starting off right now. So whole bunch of choices. It's not too late to do tomatoes and peppers as well. If you buy them as a plant, like at your nursery, you can put those in the ground and expect to get some good growth in the remaining time. So just about everything that you would be growing in a summer garden, I would suggest go ahead and put in place of any plants that you're pulling out at this time of year. So that's one of those things to consider. Melissa says, I'm having great success with Summer Crisp Nevada, Red Fire, and New Zealand spinach in 9B. That's awesome. There's a lot of great plants, especially as we move into the summer. I think that's wonderful. Hey, Thalia, thank you so much for joining as a member of the channel. I really appreciate that. That's nice to have you aboard. Sharon's asking, do you have problems with ants eating melon plants? I do not. One of the things that I try to do, as you may know from my videos, is to build a balanced ecosystem. And so I let the ants dig their holes and build their nests pretty much everywhere. Now, I do not have fire ants or harmful ants. And so I haven't had an issue with the ants eating any of my plants because I just don't have them in that large a number. But the ants that I do have, I know are food for some of the birds. I know they're food for some of the predatory wasps. I know that they have a role in my garden, which is one reason why I don't try to get rid of my ants. I just let them aerate my soil because I've got such compacted, terrible soil. But I let them be food for something else. If they did start eating my plants, there are some relatively easy things you can do. They follow each other. They'll send out a scout who finds the food. They come back to the nest. They tell the other ants, and then they march out to eat whatever that food happens to be. And you can disrupt that pattern if you find their pathway. And you can pour all kinds of things, vinegar being one of the most popular to disrupt what they're doing. You could use diatomaceous earth. You can spray it all with a good strong stream of water again, or just let them be. Because most of the time you're probably going to find the ants are harvesting some of the decaying material around your plants. There aren't a lot of plant species that are actively eating live plants. But if you do see that that's one that you might have a problem with, then you can attack those ants specifically. But in general, no, I don't have ant problems. I'm very lucky about that, and I think that's wonderful. And let's see what else we have popping up. Sharon's asking where I'm located. I'm in Colorado along the Front Range. And so Thalia and Nachi G are up north of me, and Frank Anselmo is down south of me, and I'm just outside of Colorado Springs in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado in Zone 5B. Let's see, River and Dale, good to see you here today. I've tried others, but the sugar babies are best, very delicious, about the size of a bowling ball. And that's a melon. I'm growing or attempting to grow sugar baby melons this year. Moon and Stars is another one that I'm growing from seed, and they usually give me a small harvest by the time the first frost comes. But glad that you're trying that. Those are actually some pretty tasty. They're small, and when you think about growing melons, you don't have to grow the big watermelons. You know, too often we go to the grocery store and we see the fruit, and we think that's what fruit has to look like if we're going to grow it. So we see those big watermelons, and we see that they're 130 or 140 day variety. There's no way we can grow them in our short seasons, so we don't grow watermelon. Well, yeah, we don't grow watermelon, but you can still grow many other type of melons, a musk melon or a sugar baby melon. And so as long as you match up the plant with your season, the length of your season, there's a lot of variety out there. The same with the squashes. There's a ton of different types of squash that you can grow to match your season, be it a summer squash or a winter squash. So let's talk a little bit about summer squash and winter squash, because those are also some of the ones that I'm growing. I just put in some seeds for butternut squash, which I love, and that's a winter squash. And then I put in some seeds for a yellow crookneck squash, which is a summer squash. And the big difference between the summer and the winter squash is how long you can store the fruit of those plants. And so they're called winter squash, not because we can grow them during the winter, but because that type of squash can store so well that you can eat the squash during the winter. the summer squash tends to have thinner skin. And so you'll need to eat it relatively soon after harvest. And so a zucchini is a summer squash. The yellow crookneck, like I said, is a summer squash. You harvest those, and you're generally going to eat the summer squash within a week or two for the best results. They can begin to deteriorate pretty quickly. Whereas a winter squash, like pumpkins and the butternut, they can store for months and months and still be good. Much thicker skin. So consider growing both of those in your garden because it gives you a long period of time to enjoy all that delicious fruit. You're enjoying the summer crop during the summer months, and you're enjoying the winter squash, which you're actually harvesting in autumn, and you're enjoying those all the way through winter. And I've enjoyed some of my winter squashes all the way through the holidays and the new year, depending on what it is and how you store it. So something to consider in your garden as you're choosing what to grow. And they're so packed with nutrients, and they offer so much food. And so a pumpkin or a big squash, a butternut, for instance, one squash, depending on how you fix it, is enough for a small family meal. I love making a butternut squash soup, and just a couple squashes makes a lot of soup, and you've got leftovers. And so as you're choosing the food crops to grow in your garden, think about that aspect of it. How much work you put in for what you get out. Now, we talked about the potatoes as being essentially ideal for a food crop. I think squashes are ideal for a food crop, especially if you're growing vertically. If you have a trellis for your squash and your melons to grow up, you can grow more plants closer together. So you can put more in your bed, and then you harvest and eat, or harvest and store, and you've really maximized the food production in a given bed. So I always try to grow some of those plants just because it carries me past the garden season with some of the foods that I can eat. So think about those kind of things. Okay, let's see. Okay, don't worry about being late. You can always rewatch anything that you missed, but thanks for checking in. That's great. Hey, I see Kiri Nowak has checked in and saying to Chris, I have half a watermelon in my fridge that I'm about to give to my chickens because it's getting mushy. I actually had half a watermelon that I threw in my compost pile earlier this week because it got mushy. That's another great thing actually about growing small melons, is for those of us that have a small family, we'll buy a big watermelon and we might not be able to get through it before it starts getting mushy, and then we have to throw it in the compost or feed it to the chickens. Whereas the small melons are perfect for 1 or 2 or 3 people. So I like growing the small melons because I can, but also because they never go to waste. The whole thing is eaten whenever the time comes up. Okay, Colin, my wife and her parents prefer to leave courgette. That's what it was, I guessed correctly when I was talking about the zucchini earlier, until they become marrows. So we always grow 2 or 3 plants as the less mature, as the less mature zucchini is preferred. Good point, and that's an excellent point. I really appreciate you bringing up that issue. When you're growing the squashes, particularly the courgette or the zucchini, when you harvest the fruit, you'll get completely different results. And so I agree with you. I think the most delicious zucchini or courgette is when it's about 6 inches long. 6 to 8 inches is ideal. It's tender, it's sweet, it's so delicious. I just absolutely love to have the young squash, and that's the way I prefer to eat it, which is why I grow more plants than I really need, so that I always have some of those young ones to harvest. And then I'll let others grow. The bigger fruit, I will roast because they're not as tender. So I'll roast them on my grill. I love roasted zucchini. But I'll also use them to make bread and muffins because they're not as tender. They do have a slightly different flavor, but I'll put them in a food processor, grind them up, and make the zucchini bread out of them. In fact, I actually have a video. You probably don't know this because it's one of my least watched videos, but I've got a video that shows how I harvest the zucchini and process it and make zucchini bread, and it's delicious. And so I'll use different size fruit for different purposes. And this is one of those things that I suggest you do, especially if you're new to gardening, is allow the fruit to mature at different rates and harvest at different times, and then compare the taste and the texture and decide what is best for you in fixing that particular food crop. And so the courgette, not only will I let some of them grow quite large, but then I'll process them and freeze the shredded zucchini so that I can make muffins and bread later on with that same material that I put into the freezer. So that's a great way to go. Chris is saying, how do we as chat apply for a Gardener Scott Encore? I'm not sure what you were talking to Kiri about, but I do appreciate the contribution there, Chris. Thanks. Yankee Sista, always good to see you. Check in on a Monday. A quick hello back to you. Ready to sit back and enjoy your garden. Take care to you. I hope you have a great week, and thank you so much for that contribution. Yankee Sista has commented on many of my videos over a long period of time, and I've noticed, based on the type of questions being asked and the comments being made, I consider Yankee Sista just a wonderful gardener because I can see the growth that she's making with her gardening and trying new things and having success. So thank you for that contribution. I'm so glad that you're here today and checking off, but enjoying your garden, because that's why we do it. That's what it's all about. And when it's 100 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius outside, like I'm about to hit, I'm not outside enjoying it as much as I would like to. I was outside most of yesterday. Very, very hot. Now, my son who lives in Louisiana and my daughter Kiri, we chat back and forth. My humidity is extremely low. So I forget exactly what it was yesterday, but it was about 18 or 20%. So I was outside. It was close to 90 degrees. It was about 30 degrees Celsius. And I was moving soil. I was putting seeds in the ground. I was spreading mulch. I was filling or putting pine needles in some of my pathways. I was working hard. And I was hot. I wore myself out, but I wasn't sweating that much. It wasn't that uncomfortable. My son in Louisiana had similar temperatures with a humidity of 80 to 90 degrees. And he's working inside the house with the air conditioning on and sweating because it's so hot. And so I definitely feel the pain of those of you that are in very hot areas. But regardless, I hope you have a spot that you can get outside in the shade and enjoy your garden, because it's just such a great opportunity to be out even when it's hot, as long as you're in the shade. So there you go. So garlic growers asking, do early bearing and late bearing fruit trees all flower at the same time, or do I need early bearing trees to pollinate early bearing trees and late bearing trees to pollinate late? Great question. And it's not just trees. This holds true for many of the plants that we're growing in our area or in our garden. And so much depends on your area and your zone and what you can grow. But generally speaking, the early bearing fruit trees are going to be pollinating at the same time as other early bearing fruit trees. And the late bearing fruit trees are going to be blooming at the same time as late bearing fruit trees. So yes, you should try to match those. In my garden, that's exactly what I did with my fruit trees. I did try to match the bloom time of my trees. Now, I have an additional problem, as I've mentioned in recent weeks, where we had such cold temperatures for so late. I have late freezes very often. And so I have to stay away from some of those early blooming, early producing plants. And so raspberries, for instance, blackberries, fruit trees, a lot of those type of plants that might be blooming in early spring for an early crop, I don't grow because those blossoms are going to freeze off. I've grown some peach trees and I've grown some apricot trees, and if I'm lucky, I'll get one harvest every 5 years because those are early blooming plants, and when I have a late freeze, it freezes off the blooms and I don't get any fruit. So I go with a late producing tree of most varieties that I'm growing. And so with that thought in mind, you can see why there'll be a difference. When the flower blooms, the pollen is only good for a very short period of time. And so it's blooming, it's being pollinated, and then it's starting to set fruit right away. And the late producing plants are generally blooming later, pollinating, setting the fruit, and they just don't match up. It's not true in every single case because there are some fruits that just take a long time to develop, but you do need to look at the bloom time of the trees. And my guess is what you'll find out is that those early producing trees do not have the same bloom time as those late producing trees. And that's the key point. You really want to match them up. And so if you've got a couple different types of apple or plum or peach or whatever, and you notice that they're blooming at different times, you'll probably also notice that you're not getting a lot of fruit production on those trees, and that's probably the reason why. So grow multiple trees to increase the pollination and try to grow the varieties that are close to the bloom time to have the best results. Colorado Bird Nerd, hello. We have such an intense sun at 8,000 feet in the wet mountain valley of Colorado. I'm considering garden shade cloth for my tender seedlings. Any advice for us on shade cloth? Thank you. Yes, use shade cloth. I think I mentioned last week that I had ordered and got some shade cloth. I get mine from Greenhouse Mega Store. I've also seen a lot of the garden centers are starting to carry shade cloth. I opted for a 40% shade cloth. The thing you have to think about when you're getting your shade cloth is what you want to shade and how much sun you want to keep off of your plants. And so right now, actually, the video that I'm planning to shoot, I mentioned earlier, of my salad crops, right now it's got a row cover over it. As soon as I shoot that footage, I'm putting shade cloth over it because, as I mentioned, some of those plants are starting to bolt. And so you should put shade cloth over your spring plants as soon as the days start getting warm, and you should be able to get an extra few weeks of harvest. And so especially at 8,000 feet, I'm at 7,500 feet, you want to do that earlier rather than later. And so the spinach, the lettuce, the radish, the chard, those kind of plants should probably be covered right now with shade cloth, as hot as we are getting in Colorado this next week. For your tomato plants and your pepper plants and those melons and those squashes, you can usually delay putting shade cloth over those plants until you get to the time that they are flowering. Because when the temperature is above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, you're going to start seeing problems with pollination, and the blossoms are going to start dropping off the plants. So when the plant is young, being exposed to that heat and that sun is great for a pepper or tomato plant. But when it reaches the point that they're blooming, it's not so good. That's the point that I begin putting shade cloth over those plants so that hopefully I can increase the pollination rate. And so that shade, especially early in the morning, if you can get the plants to pollinate early because the conditions are cool, the fruit is more likely to set, And then once the fruit is set, the temperature can be hot, and most of the time they'll do okay. Cucumbers can be quite susceptible to very high heat. And so you might have some of your little cucumbers that are starting to develop and then they shrivel up and die. That could be heat related, but it's the same idea. By that point, I've got my plants covered with shade, and I tend to get more fruit from those warm season plants with shade cloth. Depending on how much sun you get and how hot it gets, choose a shade cloth. I like the 40% because it still allows enough light in for those plants to continue growing. But if you're putting a shade cloth over those established plants, you might want a 60% or 70% or 80%. That's how much light is being blocked by that shade cloth, and really give it essentially a full shaded area to continue growing. And so you can match. I'm going to be putting hail cloth over most of my vegetable garden area. It isn't considered a shade cloth, but it does block about 10 to 20% of the light. I'm doing it to try to keep the hail off of my plants. And so there's an option. If you just need a little bit of shading, you can go with something like a hail cloth, or bird netting will cast a little bit of shade. And then if you really want a full shaded area to keep your cool season plants growing longer, you might want to go with a shade cloth that's really dense and blocks out most of the light, and they should do okay. So good question. I'm glad you asked about that, because that is one of those things that you can do. Let's see, Melissa's saying, we just had a week of 70 to 85, so you bet your butt I used an electric toothbrush 3 times a day just in case. I'm guessing you're talking about being out there hand pollinating your tomatoes to get that vibration and the pollinating happening. That's we talked a little bit about pollination, and so we'll talk about this in relation to the food crops. Like we were talking earlier with the male and the female flowers, the more plants you grow, the more likely you are to ensure pollination. And all of those fruiting crops need pollination for the fruit to develop. Most of the time, we don't need to worry about hand pollinating. But if you do have a drastic weather change, if you notice that you don't have a lot of pollinators, then you'll need to get out and hand pollinate, like I mentioned from that video that I did last year. And an electric toothbrush on pepper flowers and tomato flowers is often enough to just vibrate the pollen loose, because they'll pollinate themselves. You can do the same thing with green beans. There's a number of plants that we're growing in our garden that will pollinate themselves if the flower is disrupted and the pollen from the male part of the flower falls onto the part of the female part of the flower, and then you get fruit. The plants that produce the male flowers and the female flowers aren't necessarily as much of a sure bet, which is why I say grow flowers and grasses and just have a diversity within your garden, that you're attracting the butterflies and the moths and the bees and everything else that might be pollinating your plants. And so just keep growing more and more plants, not just more plants of the food crops, but more plants of all the other different types, the flowering plants that are going to bring in some of the pollinators. And then you will have fewer issues with the lack of pollination. You should have pretty good fruit set when you got a lot of bugs in your garden flying around. And even some of the bad bugs will still pollinate. It just, once they go to the flower, there's some bad bugs that are out there eating the pollen, and they're pollinating along the way. And there's some bad bugs eating the flowers, but they've pollinated along the way. So always try to figure out what insects you have in your garden, because even some of the bad bugs do have some good attributes to them. You just have to learn when to treat them as bad bug and when to accept them as a good bug, which is kind of crazy. Philip says, I can't get one of my Paw Paw seeds to germinate. Any advice? My forestry book recommends GA3, doesn't mention a parts per million solution. I don't know that off the top of my head as to using something to enhance the germination. And pawpaws, if you didn't know, are actually native to the United States. And so they are one of those plants that in the southern United States, there's actually some native pawpaw trees. It could just be a bad seed. It could be that you need to have some patience. Pawpaw seeds can take a long time to germinate. It might be the length of time, but if you do want to use a germination enhancer, I would say do a little more research and find out just exactly what the mixture should be. That's not typically the kind of thing that I do. If my seeds don't germinate, if it's a perennial plant, I'll throw it back in the refrigerator so it gets some cold stratification. If it's a plant that I know takes a long, or a seed that takes a long time to germinate, I'll leave it in my grow area under lights and just keep the soil moist for as long as possible. But there are some times that the seeds just don't germinate, and you just kind of have to accept that. So I'm not sure how many you tried and what your success rate was, but I would say just keep in a nice moist environment and have some patience and keep your fingers crossed. Hopefully that'll happen. Kiri says, I finally saw a butterfly the other day. I've also been seeing dragonflies. They like my pool and solar fountain. Good idea, Kiri. I had some butterflies flitting around yesterday. Swallowtail butterfly. That's always beautiful to see in the garden. This is another one of those things that you can do to enhance your garden and attract a lot of those beneficial pollinators, is to put in a water source. And they need water. If you've got a pool or a fountain or even just a bowl of water next to a rock, that's often enough to bring in some of these beneficial insects. So that's wonderful. That's always fun to see. Devorans found my first ladybug today. Stuck her on the bean plant that was getting chewed on. Can't wait for a bunch of these little monsters. I just started seeing my first ladybugs in numbers. I saw my first ladybug a few weeks ago. But I was out mowing some of the weedy grasses outside my garden area, saw a bunch of ladybugs and turned off the mower, and then took some of those ladybugs just like you did. I actually put them on my green stock vertical planter on my bean plants. I don't have any aphid problems there yet, but I figured I'd go ahead and at least put the ladybugs near the plants I want to save. And you can do that. Ladybugs, lady beetles, ladybird beetles are so easy to collect and then put into another area of your garden. And if you've got an aphid problem, do that. Look for the ladybugs, and then, like with the fruit tree issue earlier, if spray off as many aphids as you can, then go look for the ladybugs, and then put the ladybugs on the plant that you just sprayed the aphids off of. And any aphids that might remain, hopefully, are small in number, and you're giving the ladybugs a buffet for them to feed on. When they find an area that they like and that they're feeding on, you can expect that they'll be laying eggs nearby, and you'll have more ladybugs, probably a couple different generations during the gardening season. So it's one of those things that you can enhance the beneficial insects in your garden by transplanting them to the areas that you want them to be in. Okay, let's see. And so Kiri had told me about this, that she was pulling some creeping Charlie, which can become quite invasive, and there were ladybugs all around. And so weeds are often a good source for some of these beneficial insects because they're the habitat for a lot of the bad bugs, and that's where the good bugs are going to go to eat the bad bugs. And so look in your weeds, look in some of those things that are in the outside of your garden area, and you might be able to find some of the stuff that you're looking for, like the good bugs. So good, that's always great. Let's see. LP, another good thing. I've seen a lot of hornets in my garden hunting through the leafy greens. I just hope they aren't nesting somewhere in the yard. Otherwise, I let them be. Hornets and wasps can be great to deal with the pests that are eating our plants. You do have to be careful. I've learned the hard way. I had a pile of dried grass. If you saw the video that I did a few days ago where I used dried grass in my garden as a mulch. Well, I had a pile of dried grass a few years back and reached into that pile, grabbed up a bunch of dried grass to move into my beds as a mulch, and had some yellow jackets that had set up a nest in the dried grass. I now use gloves whenever I dig into my grass piles, but I also don't allow my grass piles to stay undisturbed for very long so that I don't have a nest develop. And so, yes, sometimes you learn that the hard way, but you can try to figure out where a hornet or a wasp will nest based on the type of insect that you have, and then just avoid putting those type of nesting areas in your garden. You can still develop those nesting areas outside your garden and encourage some of those predators. It's just a matter of knowing what their life cycle is and what they like in the way of protection to raise their young and use it to your benefit. I do that. I attract wasps. I think it's a great thing. I just know not to stick my hand in a spot where there might be a wasp, because I don't like getting stung. Neither does anyone else. So, okay, let's go ahead and talk about something that I alluded to earlier at the very beginning. So you all watch me. You watch the comments going back and forth, and there's such great information, lots of good advice going back and forth. And we have some very knowledgeable gardeners on this channel. And as you know, I've got a lot of experience and a lot of gardening expertise. But I don't know everything. And I don't know any gardener that knows everything about gardening. And so as you move forward in your gardening journey, I would encourage you to acknowledge your limitations. Recognize what you know a lot about and recognize what you don't know a lot about. And like we talked at the very beginning about the plants that I haven't had success with, so I don't grow anymore, kind of falls into that category. Recognize what doesn't work for you in your garden, and it's okay to not do that anymore. It's okay to stop growing things that just don't grow in your area. It's okay for you to not even attempt to grow something because you just can't grow it as successfully as you would like to. One of my biggest weaknesses is houseplants. There are no videos on this channel on how to grow houseplants because I just don't do well growing houseplants. I know that. I recognize that, which is why I don't give out a lot of advice on how to grow houseplants, because that's a deficiency in my gardening expertise. There are other wonderful channels out there with some great videos on houseplants, but you're not going to see it on mine. And I know why. It's because I love being outside. I love building the garden. I love growing the seeds. And when I get inside, it's a completely different environment. So for me, indoors is where I kick my feet up, I watch a video, I read a book, I watch some TV, I watch a movie, and I'm not necessarily thinking about actively taking care of plants when I'm indoors, which is why my house plants tend to be neglected. And so the house plants that I do have are the kind of plants that can be neglected for a long period of time and still survive. Because I'll wake up on the weekend and go outside and water the garden and then come in and see my houseplant and think, oh, have I watered that this week? Or was it 2 weeks ago? I just don't have the same mindset with my houseplants as I do with my outdoor garden plants. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I haven't killed any houseplants in years because I have so few and because they're quite durable. That's the way I choose to garden with my houseplants. You can do the same kind of thing, both inside and outside. Choose your plants based on what you have the ability to do. I always say try new things. I always say expand your garden with new plants and new methods, new ways of doing things, but not all of it's going to work. And when you can recognize your limitations with gardening, you have a couple different options. You can say, like in my case with the houseplants, okay, I'm done with houseplants. I'll do what I can to keep them alive, but I'm focused on the outside. Or, and this may happen in another year or two, I'll say, you know what? I've ignored my houseplants for too long. Now I need to learn more about my houseplants. I need to grow different types in different rooms with different lighting needs so that I can become a better indoor houseplant gardener. maybe at that point you'll see some videos start to appear on the Gardener Scott channel because I'll be doing more about houseplants. I anticipate that day will come, but I'm still so focused on building my outdoor garden and getting it growing that, oh well, houseplants are going to fall behind. And all those other things that I mentioned earlier, oh well, I'm not going to be growing those. Instead, I'm going to put my efforts toward what I'm more likely to have success with. Because the more success you have as a gardener, the more likely you're going to continue gardening. And so many, you probably know people like this that put a seed in the ground, they take up gardening, they don't learn what they need to know, the plant suffers, they realize it's too hard or they don't like it, or because it wasn't successful, there's no reason to continue, and then they drop gardening and never do it again. Well, do it again. And do it with something that you know you're going to be successful at. Recognize what doesn't work, and then either learn more about that thing so it will work, or learn more about that thing to realize why it doesn't work, like I did with the cherry trees and the big tomatoes. You know, I would love that beefsteak tomato, but I did enough research to know that I just can't do it, so I don't do it. Use your limitations as an educational opportunity, and use your gardening limitations to focus on those things that you know will work best for you. And when you do that, you're more likely to enjoy it. You're more likely to get out in the garden. You're more likely to talk about it, even when things like the courgette, like the zucchini, that you probably will have great success with. And that's a strength. Put that in the, yes, I know how to grow that column. And then learn from it and recognize, but next year, I'm not going to grow as many plants, or I'm not going to grow them as close together. Those are the kind of things that you can really use to your advantage as you move forward, as you become a better gardener. And like me, as you decide what videos to make. I will make videos like Scott Head does as well, that where we show what went wrong and what we learned from our mistakes. But it's so much more fun for me to make a video to show you what did work and what the success that I did have. Just like it's more enjoyable for you to take that big bag of harvest to your neighbors or your family, and you can brag about all the great things that you did. So while you're recognizing your limitations, recognize your strengths, because those two play hand in hand, and that's all part of what makes all of us a better gardener along the way. Thanks so much for being here on this Monday. I look forward to seeing you here next Monday as we do it all over again. Talk gardening stuff, answer questions, ask questions, share our ideas, but mostly just get together and spend some time with the global gardeners who all want to be better and have fun while we're doing it. I hope you have a great gardening week. I hope it's not as hot as mine's going to be. I hope you can get out there and get a lot of stuff done. And I look forward to you telling us all about it next week when we get together, same time, same place, same gardening channel. Have fun. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.